Hello and welcome to another episode of the Woollentwine Fiber Studio knitting podcast. My name is Jule and I'm the dyer and maker behind Woollentwine Fiber Studio, which is a small creative space located here in northern Germany where I play with natural dyes and natural yarns. Today is not a knitting related episode. Well, it kind of is, but it's not like my traditional I'm chatting you through my projects episode, but rather a little bit of an educational video, if you will. I know you've been waiting for this for quite a while and I've been promising to make this video for a while, but it required quite a bit of gathering up my thoughts and also getting all the relevant questions ready. So without further ado, let me tell you that this is the video about how to knit with unspun yarn. Ever since I released our first custom spun unspun yarn at the beginning of this year, or beginning of the spring this year, I know that there was a lot of interest in me sharing my tips and tricks all around knitting with this kind of special yarn type, and so I tried to gather up all my thoughts and also ask you what you would like me to chat about in this video, and now I finally managed to get it all together and will tell you a little bit about how to work with unspun yarn now. I'm looking at my notes here because I've been trying to gather up everything in the way that it's nice to follow and that you can also skip through several chapters that I'm talking about, so you can maybe just watch the parts that you're interested in or re-watch parts. And all in all, I've tried to design this video in a way that everyone can take something from it. So whether you're already experienced with unspun yarn and just want to hear some tips and tricks, then I think you can find something in this video, as well as for beginners. I think I would love this to be an encouragement to try this yarn, and if you've been hesitant because you're afraid of certain things, then I hope I can take this from you and maybe encourage you to try unspun, because it's just a wonderful way of knitting. It's very different in parts, but that shouldn't keep you from trying it. So I hope that with this video I can maybe encourage one or two people who have been afraid or not sure if it's for them. And yeah, I hope this will help everyone a little bit. I should maybe say that as a little disclaimer, this is not an extensive list of everything around unspun. It's just my personal experience and what I know works for me. Of course, it might be that some of these techniques or tricks that I'm sharing do not work for you, or that it's just not applying to your way of knitting or something. This is just what I've learned over the last couple of years of working with unspun, and also what I've learned from making an unspun, because knitting with it and making one is definitely a different story. But I hope that I can maybe use my learnings and pass them on to you, so you can maybe learn something from it too. So this video is going to be like, it has a little intro where I'm talking you through what unspun yarn actually is and how it differs from, let's say, spun yarns. Then we're going to pass to the part where I talk you through things that you can do prior to knitting with it, then things that apply while you're knitting with it, and then also a couple of aftercare things and questions that I've received specifically about things. So yeah, I hope that you will enjoy this, and I'm sorry if I have to peek at my notes every now and then, but it's just a lot of content that I gathered together. So let's see how this goes. Let's jump right in. So what is unspun yarn? it pretty much says it in its name. It's unspun. It's not spun. It's technically also called a pre-yarn because it is in the spinning process of every regular spun yarn. The unspun is actually a stage of the spinning process. So it's actually the stage where the wool has been washed, carded or combed, but mostly carded, and then made into these very long rovings, and then has been stretched to even longer and very thin rovings. For those of you who might know a little bit about spinning, a roving is pretty much just the carded wool that has just been stretched a little bit, so you can pull from it when you're using a spinning wheel or a drop spindle. So yeah, the pre-yarn pretty much is the roving stretched into a very thin roving, which is why it's also sometimes referred to as pencil roving. So pencil roving, pre-yarn, unspun yarn is pretty much all the same. So after that, if you're making a spun yarn, a spinning machine would be spinning those very thin rovings and applying a twist to them to make them more durable. And that usually happens into one direction, so either clockwise or counterclockwise. And then two of those then spun singles are applied together to add even more strength in the opposite direction. So that's how a spun yarn is made. And so the pre-yarn or unspun yarn has no twist, or just very little, and no plies in it. So yeah, it's basically the stage before a spun yarn. So what this results in is just the very thin little pieces of those rovings that are looking like this. Let me try to show you. And this actually looks twisted because I have been knitting with it, but it's not. It's two strands of those little roving pieces. Let me put one so I can show you better. So this is how it looks. You can see that the fibers are pretty loosely put together and there's no twist or ply to it. So it's just pretty much very lightweight thread of wool. And that is also why unspun works completely different than a spun yarn, because it can break easily and everything, but I'm going to cover that a little bit later in this video. But to make this yarn, or to make this kind of yarn knittable, let's say it that way, it's very crucial what fibers are in this yarn, because not every fiber blend is suitable to be used in its unspun state. That is definitely what I learned when we were making our own unspun. That's called Thrive. And I've noticed that the crucial thing about this is that the blend of fibers is a good mix of long and short staples. I should maybe explain what staples are. The staple length of a fleece of a sheep is pretty much the length of each hair. So there are long wool types which have pretty long single hairs, such as Gotland sheep, for example, or Lincolns. And then there are sheep breeds with rather short staples, and those are, for example, Merinos. There are different types, but Merino is pretty much the most famous of them. And to make an unspun yarn knittable, as mentioned, you need a good mix of long and short staples. Just because if you would only have the long staples, there's no volume that would hold them together properly. And if you have only short staples, then you have no longer pieces in between that would add up to the strength. So after all, it's actually the art of making unspun yarn is to make a good blend of different sheep breeds. So for example, for our sheep breed, for our blend, We have, I think, 5 different sheep breeds in this, just to have the best properties from each of them. And there are longer staples such as Scotland fibers in it, and also shorter such as like a merino crossbreed and some other local breeds with shorter staples. So yeah, that's also why you might experience quite some differences where, about which blend or which brand you're buying unspun yarn off. There have been quite a few brands that are making unspun by now. And you can definitely tell that each and every blend is different, even within one brand that makes different blends. For example, Hönna och Ä, who are making the Nutiden yarn, which is an unspun. You will notice differences in between the different colorways, just because they're different fiber types combined, and yeah. So you will notice a difference definitely in those blends. So that's all about the intro and what unspun yarn actually is. So next up, let me talk you through what happens before you knit with it. So after everything I've been talking you through what an unspun yarn is now, you might wonder why you would want to knit with it, because as mentioned, there's no ply, no twist, so it might break easily, right? And that actually is the case. I'm going to show you a little example here, and I'm also going to try to add a few clips to this video where I'm showing these kind of things in depth and close up, so you can actually see. But with unspun yarn, it pretty much is the case that if I just have a strand of this yarn and I'm going to pull on it, it's going to come apart super easily. So that is probably the biggest fear of many people who are new to this. And that also is one of the questions that I've received the most when I was asking you for questions about this video is how do you knit with it? That it doesn't it break? Doesn't my sweater break down quite easily when I wear it? And the answer to that is no, because as you can see, if I pull the yarn with a little bit of space between my fingers, it breaks super easily. But now let me show you what happens when I put my fingers closer together and I pull on it, because that's technically what happens in a knitted stitch when you have a sweater where you put the yarn in the situation that it's very close together. In a knitted stitch. So when I put my fingers close together and I try to pull, you can see that I'm putting pressure on this, and it's much harder to rip it apart. So it is possible, but I have to put a lot of power into it, and so your sweater won't break. And yeah, that's also why I want to encourage you to try this type of yarn. And yeah, there are also ways to prepare this yarn to make it easier to work with it, and that's the next section I want to talk you through. So yeah, let me talk you through the tips and tricks you can do before you start knitting. So the first tip or trick that I can tell you is related to what I've just previously said about the makeup of the yarn, and that has to do with a blend. So whenever you have the possibility to see what fibers the unspun is made of, you can choose a blend that might be stronger or less strong depending on your skill level. So if you're a beginner, I would recommend getting a blend that's probably a good mix of longer and shorter staples. And yeah, just make sure that you're having something that feels a little bit tougher to the touch, if that makes any sense. That's definitely one thing that I can recommend. Also, maybe look out for a slightly thicker blend, such as, for example, our Breeze is a slightly thicker blend than our colorway Storm Cloud, just because we have a little bit more of the shorter staples in this one. And that one, for example, is quite strong in my experience and how I can compare it to other blends. as well as, for example, Istex Plötulopi, which is one of the most widely available unspun yarns. That is just Icelandic wool blends, and that one is also very strong. So I would recommend maybe going for a slightly thicker blend with a good balance of long and short staples. That should definitely be a good starting point. And then it might be interesting for you to know how to determine how much you might need. And I've received a lot of questions about this. And actually it's quite hard to say, because unspun yarn mostly doesn't have an exact yardage on the labels or anything, because it's quite hard to determine the yardage of unspun yarn. But what I can say as kind of a rule of thumb is that it is usually quite a bit less in weight that you need in unspun yarn compared to a spun yarn, because there is so much more air in the yarn, and it's in a spun yarn the air is just spun out, so each gram is not gram, but each piece of thread is quite a bit heavier than for an unspun. So if you would normally say, I calculate like a 500 grams for a sweater, then you would probably need quite a bit less if you knit it in unspun yarn. What I normally say is that I calculate a 500 grams for a medium to large size sweater in a full length and slightly oversized fit. But for myself, for example, I do like some cropped sweaters, and if you like cropped sweaters as well, you could even get away with like a 300 or 400 grams of unspun, even for a generously sized sweater. So yeah, I have covered this in extents also in my introduction to our own unspun yarn Thrive. I'm going to link that here, because there I try to explain a little bit more about what fit will result in what required yardage. And it would take quite a while if I do that again now. So I'm going to link that video up there, and you can watch that one if you're interested in it. But basically, a sweater of 500 grams is pretty much a safe bet for a sweater up to a size XL. That's what I normally would calculate. And then, after you've determined how much yarn you might need for your project, it's also quite a good tip or trick to choose a certain pattern with unspun yarn, because especially if you're a beginner, it might be a little bit tricky, for example, to go for cables or something, because you might have to adjust your knitting tension quite a bit. So I would recommend, if you're a beginner, to start out with a pattern that might just have a lot of stock in it and maybe some simple texture that doesn't require a lot of pulling on the yarn, because that definitely will make it easier for you. As well as talking about tension, as well as maybe trying to relearn how to tension your yarn, because that's definitely one thing that you might have to get used to it when you knit with unspun yarn for the first time, because it's just, since it doesn't have any plies or any twist to it, it's like a little bit fragile, like I showed you. And if you are a pretty tight knitter and you have a lot of tension on it, it might break more easily. So many people whom I know are slightly tighter knitters had to kind of relearn how to tension their yarn. But I think it's also something very nice about this, because it really teaches you how to slow down and kind of wind down while knitting, which is actually something I really like. And it also, from my experience, really helps with the tension and everything if you're a continental knitter. I know continental knitting is not the most not the most popular knitting style, and most people, like not most people, but a lot of people are throwers or pickers. Is it throwers? I don't know. But you know that English style knitting where you throw the thread over your needle and then knit it. That does work with unspun, don't get me wrong, but I have a feeling that if you're starting out and you're new to this, it's a bit easier to not maneuver the thread as much and just do the continental thing where you just move the needle and pull the thread through, if that makes any sense. At least that's what I kind of got from also talking to other people who like to knit with unspun yarn. A lot of people, especially if you're doing color work with it, a lot of people said that continental knitting makes it a tiny bit easier. So maybe this part is a little bit more for the more experienced people. If you're having trouble with your yarn breaking and you're an English style or thrower knitter, maybe try continental for once. It might also be interesting to try a new technique maybe. But yeah, that's definitely the thing I can tell about tension and choosing patterns. Next up is how to use the yarn. There are several ways you can use unspun yarn, and because it's so airy, there are a lot of options and a lot of gauges you can knit this on, depending on how you're using it. So one way to use it is double-stranded, which is definitely the way I would recommend for beginners, because it adds quite some strength to the thread if you hold it double. I'm also going to share some tips about how to prepare the yarn for that in a minute. But yeah, double-stranded is definitely one way that I would recommend for beginners. Then you can also, let me show you some swatches. I've actually prepared a few swatches. So yeah, here we have a double-stranded swatch. It still is quite airy and fluffy and not as tight as some spun yarns would look like if you hold them double. Then you can also hold it with a strand of mohair, which is also very popular, I feel. Mohair is known as like a natural alternative to nylon. It's a very strong fiber, and so you can also hold that unspun yarn with a strand of mohair, and that's going to add quite some strength as well. And then you can also, of course, just use a single-stranded. But that is something I would maybe only try if you have a little bit of experience with it. And also I wouldn't use any blend of unspun yarn single-stranded. I mean, some people might be able to, but that definitely requires quite some patience and also quite some experience with unspun yarn. So yeah, definitely for beginner knitters, I would say, or beginner unspun knitters, I would say double-stranded or with another yarn, for example a mohair, would be the way to go. So let me tell you what you can do to handle the yarn or prepare it for your knitting after you chose how you want to go with it, like single or double-stranded. So yeah, let me tell you some tips about what to do next. So, about handling the yarn. First of all, if you want to use it single-stranded or with another yarn, you can just use it from the cake directly. You can also pre-wind if you are going with another yarn, but that's something I'm going to cover later. But I would say if you're going single-stranded, or if you want to knit, for example, the unspun with a strand of mohair, I would go and take the yarn from the outside of the cake. That is one thing that's very important, because it's a lot easier to take, let me see if I can show that to you, but it's a lot easier to just take the yarn off the cake, because it just lays flat there, than taking it from the center. So yeah, if you want to knit single-stranded or with a strand of mohair, just take the yarn from the outside of the cake. Then if you want to go double-stranded, you can do two things. You can either have two cakes at the same time and take the yarn from the outside as well, but I have a feeling that that leads to more breakage, at least in my opinion and from my experience. So what I like to do with whenever I want to use the unspun yarn double-stranded is pre-wind the yarn into those little balls and then just knit from the ball, because you can throw it around. It has a lot less weight and it's a lot less prone to breaking this way. And then I usually, when I pre-wind and I have, for example, a sweater quantity to wind, I just sit on a stool and I put my cakes on the floor and I just carefully try to unwrap the yarn from the outside of the cakes. That usually works quite well, but sometimes you might be in the situation where you don't know how much exactly you need, you don't want to wind too much, you don't want to start two cakes at the same time, but rather have one cake wound at the time because you don't know how much you need, or because you only have one cake left. That might also happen. And then there is something that I'm going to show you now as well, because then you can also pull the yarn from the center and pre-wind it with itself from the outside as well. And what I do to do this kind of pre-winding is I'm just going to stick my hand into the cake and I'm trying to find a piece that feels kind of like it's not in the cake deeply, but it's like in the middle. And then I just pull, and I'm going to insert some clips of how that looks to this video now, because it might look scary to pull out a whole blob of yarn out of your unspun cake, but you will be fine, don't worry. I'm showing you how this looks. It looks pretty much like a big, like a big snake of yarn, and it looks really messy. But don't worry, it's totally fine, because it might look strange at first, but it's very easy to find the beginning in this blob of yarn. And then you can just carefully, like I'm showing you here, you can just carefully take the yarn from this blob. And once you found you found the whole connection to the center, it's pretty easy to pull from the center, because what you did with pulling out this weird blob of yarn out of the center of your cake is you really decrease the tension that is in your cake, because it's spun, or not spun, but it's wound on top of each other, and so the part in the middle has been wound around quite a few times, so all the yarn from the outside is pushing to the inside, so there is the most tension. And when you just try to pull without removing a little bit of yarn from the middle first, it will break. It will just always stick in the middle and break. So yeah, that is definitely one thing I can recommend to do. I know it's scary at first, but trust me, you're gonna be fine. You're gonna be okay. So hope this little tip helps you not to be scared about this. So let me jump to the next section, and after we've covered everything you can do beforehand, before you start knitting, I want to cover a couple of tips that you can do while you're knitting with unspun yarn. One thing, and I definitely know that's an issue to many of you, because that's something I was asked about a lot, is casting on. And if you're doing, for example, a long tail cast on, you know that at some point the yarn gets really brittle. Also with spun yarn, you notice that you're going through the same area of yarn quite a few times, and so the yarn can be a bit fuzzy and brittle at that point. And with unspun yarn, of course, that's not easy. And some people told me that they are having issues with closing the round for example, if you cast on in the round and you want to close it and want to put any kind of pressure at the end to connect the cast on stitches, that the yarn breaks then. And I found a solution to that, at least that works for me, by just pre-felting the yarn, kind of. I'm also going to insert a little bit of footage about what I do to do that here, because I'm pretty much just taking the yarn in between my hands and rubbing it, just so I can felt the roving a little bit and make it slightly stronger. So I'm also going to show you how you can put a little bit more pressure on this yarn once it has been pre-felted slightly. So that's definitely one thing that works really well for me. Just pre-rubbing the yarn a little bit before I cast on with it, and it also works that you can just add on pieces to your cast on part, but I'm going to talk about that in depth in the next point. There is a technique that's pretty common in knitting with unspun yarn, and that is called spit splicing. I'm always saying this wrong. Split splice? No, I think it's spit splicing. And that is pretty much just adding on yarn to a piece of thread where it has maybe broken off or something. So yes, if your yarn breaks, you don't have to be you don't have to be sad or don't have to be scared. It's not a problem, because you can just reconnect it. And to do so, you're just going to take the yarn where it's broken off, or where it's just where you want to put the new yarn to it. You're going to take that one, place the other end on top of this end, and then you'll just rub it in between your fingers, like I just explained for the pre-felting. You're going to rub this in between your fingers, and that way the fibers in the unspun yarn will attach to each other and form a new thread. So that's pretty awesome, huh? If you notice that it's not really attaching to each other, I can recommend just using a little bit of moisture, water, or even spit. That's where the term spit splicing comes from. To just help the fibers attach. It's pretty much the same principle as you do with felting, where you apply moisture and movement or tension. No, what is it called? Where you pretty much move the fibers in water and create a felted fabric. So that's pretty much in small. That's the same principle, and it works really well. And what's even better about it is that you can omit weaving in ends, because yeah, you can just, once one of your cakes or pre-wound balls is finished, you can just add the next one with this technique without having any ends left over at the end. So that's actually one thing I really like about unspun yarn, because I really don't like weaving in ends. But yeah, that is the spit splicing technique, and you can pretty much use it everywhere. Just make sure you have a little bit of an end left. So don't do it when you have only like this much left. Like for example, if your yarn breaks at some point, and then don't continue knitting until you have just a tiny tail. Leave it a little bit more tail, because it's just easier to maneuver between your hands when the thread is a little bit longer. And actually, one thing that I've also been asked is how to do a tubular bind-off with unspun yarn. And I want to mention this at this point, because it's pretty much the same technique that I'm doing here, or that I learned to do for this. Because for the tubular bind-off, most of you will know that you need a long, very long thread, longer than what you're trying to bind off. And you have to try and pull the yarn through all the time through the loops. And as I showed in the beginning, the longer the distance is between your fingers, or between the two tension points that tension the yarn, the more likely the yarn is to break. And so that might be an issue for tubular bind-off, right? So what I do for tubular bind off is I keep the thread much shorter than I would normally do with a spun yarn. And once I get to the point where I don't have enough yarn left, I just add some more with the spit splicing method. And that works perfectly well, and you don't have the issue of having to pull like half a meter of yarn through the same loops over and over again. So you can just work with a smaller piece of yarn and then add on as you need it until you're finished with your tubular bind off. And at this point you can also pre-felt the thread a little bit if you're noticing that you're having issues with pulling it through still. And that works really well. I could definitely tell, and I hope this is a little trick that might also be helpful for those of you who are quite experienced with unspun yarn. Because when I tried this for the first time, it was just really mind-changing, and I was really happy that I found out this works. So that is the part about what you can do while you're knitting with it. So now let me cover a couple of things about aftercare. So next up, let me chat you through some aftercare tips for your knitted garments out of unspun yarn. To do so, I should maybe explain that unspun yarns normally have quite a bit more lanolin in them in comparison to spun yarns, just because spun yarns normally get washed again after they've been spun, which is not the case for unspun yarns. And generally, because of them being less manufactured, they are pretty close to a sheep's fleece still. I mean, it has been washed, but it's the closest yarn you can get that's to a sheep's fleece, I would say. And so most blends of unspun yarn do contain some lanolin still, and that, together with the natural properties of wool, that is normally pretty dirt and odor and water repellent, that leads to the fact that you really don't have to wash your knits often. I mean, that's a general rule for natural yarns, I would say, but especially for unspun yarns, you really don't have to wash them often. Most of the time, just a good airing out helps. And I know it might sound gross, but to be honest, I really feel like, especially with unspun yarn, the airing out helps so much that you really don't need to wash it often. But of course, you do have to block your knits, or you don't have to, but most people like to block their knits after they've been working with it. And so I'm going to explain what to do if you have to block or wash your unspun garment. There are a couple of things that you just might want to take care of to make it last longer and not have any issues with it. So one thing is, keep an eye out for the temperature that you're blocking or washing your unspun garment in. Because as I showed you with the little pre-felting, this kind of yarn is a lot more prone to felting than a spun yarn would be. So, as mentioned, felting is caused by big temperature changes, water and movement, and that's basically what we want to avoid when we block it. So, of course we cannot avoid the water, but we can avoid temperature shocking and we can avoid the movement. So just keep an eye for the temperature and really just use lukewarm, rather too cold than too warm water. You can add a splash of a pH neutral wool wash. That's definitely not necessary, but it can be nice to use a pH neutral wool wash with just a little bit of lanolin in it, just to give the wool back some of its natural grease and make it last even better. So that's what I normally do. I just put a splash of a pH neutral lanolin rich wool wash in, but only if you have one that's not necessarily a rinse one. So just take a no rinse one, because you don't want to be pushing your knit into water and rinsing it after having washed it. The less movement you can give it, the better. So yeah, just try to take one that's a no rinse. If you don't have anything like that, just leave the wool wash out. It's totally going to be fine. The effect that blocking has, where the stitches even out and everything, mostly comes from the water, so it's not necessary to put a wool wash in. But once you've put your wool wash potentially into the water, just submerge your the item you want to block or to wash slowly into the water, really slowly. Don't move it too much, and don't like wring it around or anything. Just push it in and wait for it to soak for about 20 to 25 minutes, as you would normally do for blocking your knits. And then what I find is quite important is when you take it out, try to grab it as a whole and not have a part hanging out of it, because with the nature of unspun yarn, if you have, for example, a sleeve that's dropping down and that's being pulled by the water quite a bit while you're pushing the water out of the rest, then it stretches the sleeve quite a bit. So what I've found out, what works really well, is just grabbing it all together and trying to squeeze as much water out with your hands as I can. And then I normally spin dry the garment, like squeeze out as much as you can. You will notice it's going to run out of the garment quite quickly, the water I mean, just because, yeah, it's very easy to run out of the very airy yarn again. So you won't have to add a lot of pressure to get quite some water out. But once you got everything as dry as possible with your hands, you can give it a spin dry. That's what I normally do. But I should put a quick disclaimer, I'm owning a spin dryer that I have for my yarn dyeing, so I don't know what your washing machine might be doing. Just make sure that you definitely have a washing machine that only has a spinning cycle and run that one on the lowest setting. And what I would look out for is that it's actually an only spinning cycle, because I know, especially in Germany, I know there are quite a few rinse and spin cycles in the washing machines, and yeah, you don't want to add any more water where you cannot control the temperature and then move it all around, because as mentioned, it's going to felt. So just make sure that your washing machine has a spinning only cycle, then you should not have any issues. But if that's a bit too scary for you, you can also just wrap it into a towel, just squeeze the excess water out, and then lay it flat to dry. That's also what I do after spinning it. I just lay it flat to dry, because as mentioned, if there is a heavy part that still has quite some water in it, it might stretch the garment at that point. So just lay it flat to dry. You will notice it will dry quite quickly, and that's also one of the good things about unspun, that it really dries super quickly. And yeah, I think that is it, what I can tell you about the aftercare things. I hope you're not too scared. I mean, I've been pretty hard with some of my unspun garments, and there's never been an accident where I felted something unintentionally. I felted some swatches just because I was curious, and I'm going to show them to you maybe at some point to see how our own unspun yarn felts. But so far all my unspun garments are still in good condition and have not felted. So it's all good. So yeah, I think that's everything about the aftercare tips. Next up, let me address a couple of questions that I've received over the last couple of months. So next up, let me answer a couple of questions that you've been sending me after I asked what you would like to know in this video. And I think one of the most asked questions is unspun yarn soft? And I never know how to answer these kind of questions, because softness is a completely individual thing, and some people might experience yarns in a very soft way that others might find prickly and cannot wear next to their skin. So that's always a tricky question to answer, but what I can say is that if you want to come from the sheep breeds, I mean, there are fine wools and more coarse wools, and some are just softer than others. I would say that if you're taking a rustic wool, a really rustic kind of coarse fleece, and you turn it into a spun yarn, it's going to be quite rustic. But if you just turn it into an unspun, just because it has not been twisted so much, so the hairs are not sticking out as much, if that makes sense, I feel like it's softer in the unspun than it would be in a spun yarn. For example, I have made a couple of limited edition yarn blends in the last couple of years, and I had one that was kind of close or similar to what we have in our unspun yarn Thrive now, and that definitely was more rustic than the unspun. So I think that proves that even if you're having quite a rustic raw wool, it can be quite a bit softer in the unspun yarn than in the spun yarn, if that makes sense. But yeah, after all, you will have a yarn that normally has quite a few, quite a bit of a halo. That's just the nature of many unspuns, because yeah, it's just pretty much a roving that you're knitting with, and of course things have not been put together as tightly, so there are some halo-y kind of effects to that yarn, and it normally, I don't know if you can see that, let me maybe show you, but you can see, let me show you, you can see that there are a couple of hairs sticking out of this swatch. So yeah, generally it's not like a super wash merino or anything. It definitely normally has kind of a rustic feel to it, just because of the halo and everything. But I feel it's not necessarily coarse or anything. It still normally is quite soft. But yeah, as mentioned, quite an individual topic, and I think just go and try for yourself if you would like to see if it's for you. Sorry, I had to adjust the lighting quite a bit because we're having a really overcast, weird, rainy, stormy day, so I hope you can still see me. But I wanted to say about the softness thing. I know that some of you might have tried Plötulopi before, and that definitely, I would say, is one of the most rustic unspun yarns I have tried so far. If you compare it to, for example, our unspun yarn Thrive, that one is much softer, as well as many Nutiden blends that I've tried. I think that's also, so Plötulopi is the most rustic of them all. So maybe if you've tried Plötulopi and you are not sure if it's just too rustic for you, maybe try a different brand of unspun, because it might not necessarily be as rustic. And I can definitely tell that with our unspun yarn Thrive, I think that's the softest unspun I have tried so far. Not wanting to put any advertisement here, but just to put to give it a relation, maybe, for those of you who might be scared that they're too sensitive to use unspun yarn. The next question that I've received quite a few times is, does it felt? And that's what I also already covered in the aftercare part. It is more prone to felting than a spun yarn, yes, but with proper care and everything, I don't think that's an issue. I mean, if you do want to use it, for example, for socks, it might not be and you want to wash them all the time. I don't know if that's the right yarn choice, but generally I haven't found any, I haven't treated them any differently than my other garments that I've made out of natural yarns, and so far I haven't noticed a big difference. So if you're doing the proper aftercare, like I just told you in the video, and if you're just making sure that you're not washing it too often, and if you do, you're being careful, I don't think there is a big issue. So yes, it does felt more easily. No, it's not a problem. So the last question I have here today is, does unspun yarn pill a lot? And that was the one that I found the most interesting to answer, because it takes a while. You have to wear a sweater for a while to make it, to see if it pills or not. So it's definitely a good question to ask, because you cannot really find out for yourself before you wear it a couple of times. And so I want to answer that for you. So I would say yes, unspun yarn does pill, but not more than any other natural yarns, I would say. So from my experience, natural yarns generally tend to pill after a while, but with unspun yarn, because it has this fluffy little halo, it also makes pretty fluffy little pills, and you can take them off super easily. For example, you don't even need like a fabric shaver or anything. You can just take them off with your hands. At least that's how I find it. And for more reality and honesty here on YouTube, I've brought a really old and really grubby work sweater of mine that I've knitted out of an unspun yarn, just to show you how it looks like. So this is the sweater. The pattern is called Juist, and I forgot the designer's name, and it's knit out of Nutiden yarn. And let me show you the sleeves, because I think this is the part where you can see it best. It does pill, definitely, but I should maybe mention that this sweater is worn like in the colder months. When I'm working, I like to put my dye pots outside to make them cool off, and to also not have all the dyeing fumes and everything in my room. So I like to take them outside, and then I work outside quite a bit when I'm moving the wool and when I'm just taking yarn out and in and stuff. So I normally wear this sweater, I don't know, a couple of hours a day in the coldest season. And this one has a full season of me working in it full time behind itself. And I think, considering that, I think it still looks pretty okay. I mean, of course there are some pills, and you can see that it has been worn. But I think, yeah, considering it has been worn a few hours a day and I've been working in this, like pretty much moving a lot in it, I think it's okay. And also, let me show you, I don't know if you can see, but this is one of the pills. Can you see? It's not focusing, right? Let me see if I can move closer to the camera and show it. Yes, here we go. There's one of the pills. And the thing is that it's just so fluffy, I can just easily take it off. And I think that's a lot easier than it is with some other yarns, like other spun yarns. So the answer is yes, it does pill, but not more than any other natural yarns, and the pills are easy to remove. So that's my experience, at least. And I think, as mentioned, this has seen some rough work, and I think it's still okay. So nothing to worry too much about, I guess. So yeah, I think this also brings me to the end of this video. I hope it was kind of helpful for you, and that you enjoyed me chatting you through a couple of experiences I've made. Let me know if it was helpful for you. If you could leave a comment and just feedback me on this, it would be really lovely, because I'm planning to have a couple of more of these, like, I don't want to call it educational, but let's say encouraging videos where I'm sharing some experiences to maybe encourage some of you who have not tried something particular to try it maybe. And so it would be lovely to have a bit of feedback and how you liked the format, if you would like me to change something, if something was very helpful in particular. That would be lovely, just so I can always improve what I do. And yeah, after all, I hope you enjoyed this. I hope you feel encouraged to maybe try unspun yarn if you haven't yet, and that you maybe learn something new if you're already experienced with unspun. And until I can show you my next knitting projects in unspun yarn, I hope you're having a good time, and see you in the next episode. Bye!